All right, so we're going to talk a bit about the mind-body problem now. This is the first in a series of philosophical problems we'll be discussing in this course. And in order to get a fix on what this problem is, to introduce the problem, it's important to get a fix on or have some understanding of what we mean when we're talking about the mind. There are two aspects to discussion of the mind. Sometimes when we talk about the mind, what we're talking about is what are called mental states. So really things like pains and pleasures, itches, bodily sensations are an example of this sort of thing. We also have perception of the world, visual perceptions, auditory perceptions. We have mental images. We can imagine what it's like to be in a certain place, say. We have feelings about things. We can get angry, we can get sad, we can be happy. We can also be in moods. We can be elated or depressed or bored, say. And then we also have what are called propositional attitudes. We have beliefs about the way the world is. We have desires for the world to be a certain sort of way. All these kinds of things are examples of mental states. But in addition to that, we can also think about the mind as involving certain capacities and processes associated with the exercise of those capacities. So in psychology, we study things like attention and categorization, memory, problem solving and reasoning, learning, language. All these things are things that psychologists are interested in understanding. And they're not mental states, but they're abilities that people have, abilities to attend or abilities to remember, abilities to solve problems. So these are also the kinds of things that fall under the general heading of mind. So when we think about the mind-body problem, one way of getting into it is by reflecting on the fact that mental phenomena and mental states in particular seem to have some sort of peculiar features. In particular, mental states seem to be directly accessible. They seem to also be the kind of thing that individuals have a special kind of authority about in their own case. The sort of thing that people make judgments about that are infallible. And this final characteristic of being self-intimating. So we'll talk about each of these things just briefly. Directness. When we talk about directness, what we have in mind here is an epistemological feature of the mental. So for example, knowing that you're in a certain mental state, like having a headache, doesn't require you're making a judgment where you have to reason your way to that conclusion. You just, when you have a headache, you sort of know you do, and if you know that you have a headache, the source of that knowledge is nothing like some kind of explicit reasoning. And for this reason, if you were to say to someone, I have a headache, it would be strange to respond to them by saying, how do you know that you have a headache? That's just a silly question. And there's an interesting contrast here in the case of knowing about the states of one's body. So for example, knowing that you have a brain tumor. It would be very silly if someone were to ask you, how do you know that you have a brain tumor? It'd be silly to answer that question by saying, well, I just know that I have a brain tumor. I mean, it's not possible to just know things like that, whereas it is possible to just know that you have a headache. So our judgments about mental states seem to have a peculiar quality of directness to them that our judgments about our bodily states do not. Likewise, when we think about first-person authority, it seems fair to say that each of us is in a better position to know about our mental states than anyone else is. So with respect to headaches, for example, I'm in a better position to know about my headaches than you or anyone else is. But that's not true about my bodily states. I'm not in a particularly privileged position with respect to knowledge about my brain states, like the possible fact that I have a brain tumor. There are people who are in a much better position to make those judgments. So, for example, a neurologist who has examined me thoroughly and looked at MRI or CAT scans of my brain will be in a much better position to make that judgment than I am. Infallibility is related here. So infallibility is just the idea that you can't be wrong when you make judgments about your mental states. If you think you have a headache, then you do. There's no possibility of error. But there clearly is a possibility of error in the physical case. You might think that you have a brain tumor, but you may or may not. Maybe you're just a hypochondriac, right? And you think every time that you have bad headaches, you're going to have that. The source of that must be some kind of terrible problem with your brain. But that may not be true. Self-intimacy is this idea that mental states, as it were, kind of announce themselves to us, or certain kinds of mental states anyway, announce themselves to us in a way that physical states do not. So, for example, if you have a headache, then you automatically know that you do. It's not really possible, at least not in the ordinary case, to have a headache and not know that. But it's perfectly possible to have a brain tumor and not know about it. One could have an asymptomatic brain tumor, for example, that doesn't produce double vision or headaches or any of the characteristic symptoms of brain tumors, right? So it's not true about states of the brain that they're self-intimating, whereas it is true, or it seems to be true, of at least some of our mental states. So what is the problem here? The general problem that arises then is that these two domains, the domain of the mental states like pains and beliefs and things like that, and the domain of the physical, the domain that includes things like bodies and biological systems and brains and things like that, seem to be, on the one hand, both very intimately connected to one another and at the same time radically different in character. And this is the kind of tension that we see with respect to the mental and the physical, or the mental and the bodily, that gives rise to this problem. So in terms of the close connection, it's worth noting that mental states like beliefs and desires and pains at least appear to be causally responsible for our behavior, right? So say you go to the store to buy a quart of milk. It would appear that your doing so is caused by the fact that you want a quart of milk and you believe that quarts of milk are available at the store. Those mental states cause you to go to the store. Or similarly, if you exhibit a certain kind of expression on your face, which is indicative of pain or anger or happiness or something of that sort, the appearance that we see is one where the mental state causes the behavioral expression. So there's a kind of close connection between mental states on the one hand and behaviors on the other. And going in the other direction, it seems that there's an effect as well on the mental of changes to the brain. So if you drink lots and lots of coffee, for example, it'll make you jittery. Or if you drink a lot of alcohol, it might lead you to slur your speech, or various effects. What we can see is this close dependence. You make changes to the mental, it affects your behavior. If you make changes to the body, say by ingesting certain kinds of chemicals, say a caffeine or alcohol, that affects your mental life as well. On the other hand, it seems that there's a problem of explanation. And the problem can be put this way, that it's not at all clear how we can explain certain kinds of phenomena, certain kinds of mental phenomena, like the feeling of being in love, or the pain that you're in when you have a terrible migraine headache, or your consciousness of yourself as a particular kind of entity in the world, or finally your ability to understand this not particularly transparent lecture. Well, I hope it's actually more transparent than this example suggests, but all these mental kind of phenomena seem to be difficult to understand just in terms of the operation of a brutally physical object like the brain. And this is quite clearly going on, for example, when attempts are made to explain our mental life in terms of activity at the brain level. And a lot of attention has been devoted to the specific case of consciousness and conscious awareness our pains and pleasures and our emotional experiences and so on, it seemed to many people that however sophisticated the neuroscientific explanation might be, there's always some sort of gap between that explanation and the phenomenon that we're interested in. And this actually has a name, and it's a name that's in wide circulation in philosophy of mind circles. It's called the explanatory gap. And it's just the idea that there seems to be this sort of difficulty in crossing from the domain of explanation at the neurological level or the physical level in any sort of way to the domain of the mental. It seems just, to many people, it seemed impossible in principle to get satisfying explanations of mental phenomena like consciousness in terms of brain processes. It just seems like something that cannot be done in principle. Now, and this is an idea which has been much discussed in the recent literature, but it actually has a quite long history in philosophy. We can trace it back, for example, to a thought experiment that was given by the philosopher Leibniz hundreds of years ago, involving this mental mill. So Leibniz asked us to imagine that we created a machine that was capable of thinking, that was capable of mental processes. And further, he asked us to imagine that we could walk around inside the machine. So it's a very, very large machine, and we can just go inside of it and sort of, stroll around and see what's going on. And we could come to some understanding of actually how the machine works. But the question that Leibniz asked was, would it be possible to explain the thinking of the machine in terms of the working of the parts of the machine? And his intuition about this was that the answer is no. That there was just simply no way you could explain the fact that the machine is thinking or having an experience in terms of the working of its parts. And that's really just a kind of recasting in an older form of this explanatory gap. We can think about this in slightly more contemporary terms. If you've seen the movie The Fantastic Voyage, for example, you know that that involves a story in which there's a crew of people who go and travel. They're shrunk down and they travel inside the body of a man and his brain in particular. So in this thought experiment, we can imagine that we were doing that, we were walking around inside the brain of a living organism, much like the crew of the ship in The Fantastic Voyage does. And we can ask ourselves, what would you see? And in particular, would you observe mental processes? Would you observe mental phenomena? Or would you not? Would that somehow not be apparent to you? Would that not be something that you could pick up just in virtue of investigating the workings of this physical mechanism? Very much the way Leibniz was thinking about it in terms of the mental mill. And again, most people's intuition about this is that the answer is no. You wouldn't observe thinking, you would just observe the firing of neurons. And that alone wouldn't help you really to understand what thinking was or how it came about as a result of brain activity.